I'm going to speak to you today about thematic analysis using MAXQDA. There's quite a lot to get through, so I'm going to pick out a few specific things to discuss. I will be keeping my eye on the Q&A as I go, because in this session, sometimes it's quite useful to answer questions about particular phases of thematic analysis that I'm discussing at that moment. So I will try and keep my eyes on the Q&A, but I may miss some questions depending on how many there are, but then we'll come back to them at the end. Okay, so let's get going. So thematic analysis. Thematic analysis is actually a fairly lengthy tradition, and I've got an umbrella on this slide because thematic analysis is a broad term that kind of encapsulates quite a lot of different approaches, actually. So I see it as a umbrella term, and if people say to me, oh, I'm doing thematic analysis, my first question is, what type of thematic analysis are you doing? Okay, because there are different traditions. You can see here three textbooks which discuss different approaches to thematic analysis, but I'm sure many of you are here because you're interested in thinking about how you can implement reflexive thematic analysis, which is the strand of thematic analysis that's very much been popularized by Brown and Clark since their first article in 2006 on the topic, and they published a very amazingly excellent textbook in 2021 where they detail their approach to thematic analysis that they now call reflexive thematic analysis and differentiate it from other strands. And that's the one that I'm going to focus on today as an example, but many of the things I talk about today and MAXQDA features that I discuss are relevant to other types of not only thematic analysis, actually, but other types of analysis. But we're just using this as an example. And if any of you have been to any of my sessions before, you'll know that I'm a big fan of making sure that we use software in relation to our method's needs. Okay, and so thinking about, okay, what is thematic analysis, and then thinking about how MAXQDA can support the phases of thematic analysis is very much reflects my way of thinking about software. Okay, so here is an overview of the 6 phases of reflexive thematic analysis as described by Brown and Clark. Okay, and actually the names of these phases have changed a little bit over the years as they have refined and been more specific about them. Okay, one thing to say right at the outset is that what we'll see is that there is some blurring between these phases, and also, although this looks like a sequential process, actually quite a lot of iteration happens between the phases and within the phases as well, which is very characteristic of most qualitative approaches, as I'm sure many of you are already aware. But what we're going to do today is we're going to power up thematic analysis. So we're going to think about how we can harness the tools that we have at our disposal through MAXQDA in a powerful way for all of the tasks that are involved in thematic analysis. And I'm going to take that phase by phase. Okay, so let's start off with phase 1. And this is a photo from a table fairly early on in their textbook, page 35, I think it's on, where they have a summary overview of the phases. And so I've picked that out, but you'll see here that I have highlighted in 2 different colors a couple of elements within here. So in red, I've highlighted the tasks that are involved in accomplishing this phase, which is familiarizing yourself with the data set. And then in green, I'm highlighting the levels at which we work when we undertake those tasks. So what they say is that in this familiarization phase, we need to become deeply and intimately familiar with the content of our entire data set, all the materials that we have, okay, through a process of what they call immersion. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with that idea of being immersed, being deeply connected to the data. Practically, they say that that involves reading and rereading our data many times over. And if we were working with audio, then we would listen to or watch if it was films. But we're going to look and familiarize multiple times, not just once, but over and over again. Okay, so that's the first task. And then as we're doing that, we are going to be making brief notes about any ideas we have about our analysis, any insights we have, any thoughts we have as we're familiarizing. And we're going to do that at a number of levels. We're going to do that in relation to each data item, each bit of data that we're familiarizing with, and the data set as a whole. Okay, so at least 2 levels happening there. So definitely a couple of tasks and a couple of levels at which to do those tasks. So how can MAXQDA help? Okay, so here I've got a list of a few ways that MAXQDA can help with the immersion idea, working very much at the data level. Okay, and that can happen in a slow, low, so very much at the data level, or a much faster and higher level way inside MAXQDA. In the interest of time, I'm only going to pick out and show you a couple of things from each phase because I just haven't got time to look at absolutely everything. And that's one of the characteristics of MAXQDA. There's so much opportunity and so much flexibility. And so in the interest of getting through all of the phases, I'm picking out a few things. So what I want to do is to show you a couple of illustrations from MAXDICTIO tools, which is a part of MAXQDA's feature set, which allows us to read and reread at a fast, high level. So this is really using tools to help us accomplish what is otherwise a very slow, low exercise. But of course, we can work in a slow, low way inside MAXQDA as well. But let's just pick out a couple of these. So a high, fast way of familiarizing with the content of the data, remember that's what we're doing, is to do a word frequency. So a word frequency, MAXQDA will very quickly count how many times each individual word occurs. And you can do that within one transcript or document that you're working with, or across all of them, or amongst activated groups of document. Okay, so here's an example of words. The bigger the word, the more frequently it occurs. But something that's very interesting or particularly useful is that we've now got word combinations in MAXDICTIO as well. So as well as looking at individual words, we can look at phrases. So here's an example of the visualization of word combinations. This data, by the way, is actually the sample data set that Brown and Clark make available along with their textbook. So in their textbook, they talk about a number of projects, and one of them is to do with a data set from Facebook about individuals who have decided or otherwise not to have children. Okay, and so smiley face emoji comes up as the most frequently occurring phrase because in a lot of those Facebook posts there are smiley face emojis, which has been translated into text as part of the project setup. So we can get these results as lists with frequency counts as well as visualizations, but very quickly, just looking at the visualizations, you can get a sense of what's going on in the data just by focusing in on individual words and getting a little bit more context by focusing on phrases or word combinations, as MAXQDA calls them. If we want to delve down into the data a little bit more, we can access from these word clouds the actual context within an interview transcript or whatever the data is, but we can also see that in an interactive word tree where we can see the roots or the branches coming off and coming before particular individual words, and then start to see a little bit more about the context within which particular words or phrases are used. So here I was interested in the sort of active choice not to have children. So focusing in on choose not and seeing what's said before and after that phrase can give me a lot more of an understanding of that kind of concept in the data. So I mentioned earlier that you can get back to the context. So next I've got a screenshot that illustrates that. So here a slightly different phrase, life without kids. And I can jump back from those previous visualizations and see that in context and explore it in more detail at that low level. So we can traverse through the levels through the use of tools. Okay, so those were the few things I wanted to say at that point, but this is only one stage of that phase one. Remember that Brown and Clark talk about deeply familiarizing ourselves, but also making brief notes about analytic ideas that we have as we're familiarizing. And there's lots of tools at our disposal to capture those notes. And it may depend on which level that we're doing that. That's going to inform the useful tools. Okay, so I'm going to talk about paraphrases in relation to each individual data item. And here I'm understanding a data item as a segment of data that's interesting, and then look at memos in relation to the data set as a whole. Okay, and then we'll also have a look at how we can visualize those notes. We can visualize those notes in a variety of different ways. There's a conceptual question in the Q&A. I'll come back to that at the end if that's okay, because it's not specifically about something that I'm talking about right now. The question in the chat about whether it's possible to make word clouds only for highlighted or relevant parts of the data set. Absolutely, you can do that. So it can be based on a code or retrieve segments or activated documents. So you can filter and generate those visualizations from all kinds of different places. Absolutely. And that makes that familiarization even more in-depth and conceptually meaningful, doesn't it, when you're focusing on particular parts of the data set. Okay, so thank you for those questions. Let's go to the next slide, which is to talking about paraphrasing. Okay, so paraphrasing in MAXQDA is the idea that you see something interesting, a segment of data that's interesting, and you make a little note about that. So you might summarize it down, which is the sort of one of the ways of thinking about paraphrasing, or just add your thoughts about what's going on there. And those paraphrases are visualized in a number of different places. On the right-hand side, you get to see them, but they're also gathered together at a code as well. So even though you're putting those analytic notes within the data, you're integrating those analytic notes at the points of the data where you are seeing them, you are also able to gather them together. Okay. What we can also do, and I think this attends to another question in the Q&A at the moment, which is about, can we make memos for each data item instead of comments? So I was just talking about paraphrases. You can actually have memos, comments, or paraphrases related to individual data items, but its comments are linked to coded segments. And at the moment, we haven't done any coding. So it would be paraphrases or memos. I think paraphrases are more powerful for this phase of thematic analysis for reasons that will become clearer when we start to think about coding. But you can stick memos. Memos are like little sticky notes, and you can stick them anywhere. There's a column, this column here, there hasn't got any in them in this example, but you could stick a memo there, and that would come up here as a yellow note there as well. So that answers the question. So one of the things about MAXQDA's writing spaces, and there are many of them, so paraphrases, comments, memos, summaries, you can also write in documents, is that often you can make a variety of different choices. So some of that is to do with what you feel most comfortable with, but some of that choice will be to do with what you might want to do next in your analysis. So having a full understanding of the suite of possibilities and also thinking ahead of what you want to do next can inform that process. But what I've got here at the moment is showing you a memo about the whole data set. So in this example, their data set is actually one document And therefore I can stick a memo. This is a memo here, which is stuck to the whole data set. There's two documents here, but it's just the same data brought into MAXQDA in two different ways to illustrate a couple of other things. But here you can see that I can write a memo about that data set. And this document summary I've got here is actually their description of the data set. And then you can add more there. So as you're becoming more familiar with the entire data set, then you can add your memos at that level. So that's a note at the level of the whole data set as opposed to the individual data items. But if we were working with interview data, we would maybe have 10 or however many documents, one for each interview, and you would probably want to make notes about each interview transcript as well. So then you'd have 3 levels. You'd have the level of the individual segment of data that was interesting to you, the level of the whole transcript, and then the level of all of the transcripts together. Okay, what's really powerful is the visualization of all of these, which I've started to allude to a little bit, but you can visualize notes at the individual data item level and also gathered together via a code. So if you're working with paraphrases, you see your notes in the margin here associated with the individual data item, but as you create paraphrases, MAXQDA is automatically gathering them together at one special code. It's a special place in the coding schema called paraphrase segments. And when you double click on that area, you get to see all of them together. So you can flick through them all, even if they're in multiple different data files. Okay, so that's really very, very powerful. Okay, so those are a few ideas of some of the tools that we have available in MAXQDA for that first phase. Let's move on to the second phase, coding. Okay, remember, red are the tasks and green are the levels. So what they say is that here in this phase, we need to work systematically through the whole data set in a fine-grained way. So slowly, carefully at that low level. And we need to identify segments of data that appear to be potentially interesting, relevant, or meaningful in relation to our research questions. And as we're doing that, we apply pithy, which means kind of specific and carefully worded, analytically meaningful descriptions. Okay, and that's how they describe what a code is, a pithy, analytically meaningful description. Okay, and you apply those code labels to the segments of data. And then they give us some advice about the coding process, which I won't read out. You can come back and look at the slides and read it all in detail. What I want to allude to here is that they explicitly say that we code at different levels, okay? At the explicit or surface meaning, so what's actually explicitly said and seen at the level of the content, which they and others refer to as the semantic level, through to a more conceptual or implicit or interpretive level. So kind of more reading through the lines, which is sometimes referred to as latent. But they say something really important, which is coding's not just about summarizing or reducing content. It's also about capturing your analytic take, your interpretation, you're capturing through the process of coding. Okay. And then they say, okay, you code the data in those ways, systematically and thoroughly. And then they say something really important that we'll come back to later. When you've done that, then you collate all of those and you compile the segments at the codes. Okay, so that's seen as a separate stage. I'll come back to that in a moment. But first of all, here's a list of many more options for coding in MAXQDA than I've got time to go through today. I'm just going to pick out a couple of really key things that help us to see how using MAXQDA can power up our analysis. The first is to categorize paraphrases so we can build on our paraphrases. Okay, and then the second thing is that we can continually retrieve, review, and recode our data as we go, because that gathering together of the segments that they talk about as a separate step happens automatically in MAXQDA as we do the first step of coding. Okay, and that's because Brown and Clark are working manually, mainly with their data, okay, in hard copy, not using software like MAXQDA. I understand that they're starting to be more open to using software but when they wrote the book, they talk about how they work manually rather than using software. It's also worth knowing, I'm sure some of you have been to other spotlights that have focused on AI assist and other auto coding options that can help us with this process. But let's focus on building on paraphrasing, because that really in a thematic analysis is a really beautiful tool in MAXQDA that really gets us from those initial analytic notes that we've made at each data item to thinking about what the codes are. And you've got a tool which is designed specifically for that, categorize paraphrases. So you can open that up and you get a table here. You can see the segment that you paraphrased over here on the right hand side, adjacent to what you wrote previously. And in this window, through a process of dragging and dropping, you can create new codes and apply them to the paraphrase segments all together in this window. And that's a really neat way of translating those initial analytic ideas into the codes. Okay. And here is just a screenshot to illustrate the point I made, that the collation of the code labels then compile the data segments that they talk about as a separate thing happens automatically as you're coding. So you don't have to think about that as a separate exercise. So you can see down here in your code system, all of the codes that you've created are listed there. And when you open them up, you get to see everything there just automatically by virtue of that process. I just wanted to show you a screenshot of the AI assistance with coding, which is relatively new. And here, what you can do is you can create a code and give it a definition in a memo, and then have MAXQDA's AI Assist look through a document for segments of data that pertain to that label and that definition that you've given. Okay, the more specific you are in relation to your definitions, the more precise and useful the resulting coding is. But what's really nice about this is not only have I found in my initial experimentations, this tool hasn't been available for that long, but in my initial experimentations, I find that it's doing a really good job. Especially if you have a very precise definition. But really usefully, MAXQDA here is giving us the rationale, the explanation for why that segment has been coded to the code. So why it is that it fits with the explanation. And that's really, really useful. So if you wanted to use AI Assist, then you could to incorporate that stage of thematic analysis. Especially useful in this kind of reflexive thematic analysis, because we're continually thinking about how AI Assist is helping or otherwise. All right, I'm already way over time, so let's move on to phase 3, generating initial themes. So here what we're doing is we're looking across the whole data set again, that's the green highlight, and we're looking to identify shared patterns of meaning in those codes in order to start to group the codes together into themes. And they talk quite extensively here about that. So I just want to show you a few tools that we have at our disposal to help us to do that. There's several here. I've got illustrations to show you today of subcode statistics, the code matrix browser, code hierarchies, and the smart coding tool. But you can see by looking quickly at this slide that there are all kinds of other tools that are also usefully helpful for this phase of generating initial themes. But remember, what we're doing is we're thinking about identifying shared patterned meanings across the whole data set. So here I've got subcode statistics, and this is giving me a sense of which codes that hang underneath another top code are occurring, are coding more or less of the data. So that's giving me a sense of pattern meanings, across the data set. I didn't mean to press that button yet. And also here, what we can do is see things comparatively. So the segment matrix is also a really, really powerful way of seeing the actual qualitative data. Obviously, this kind of graph is quantifying in some way, but we also want to see the qualitative data. So I can construct a matrix which is picking out segments, and I can make comparisons based on that level. Oops. Okay, and that can be generated from a code matrix browser as an example, or I can generate one of those segment matrices myself. But the one in the background is actually come directly from here. So this is a code matrix browser when I've got particular codes I'm interested in by documents. In fact, these are not documents. These are the Facebook, the people who have posted the posts in Facebook. So this is one person has got 7 segments about this code here, and I can make a comparison on the level of the codes and see them side by side on a qualitative level. So both quantitatively and qualitatively, we have tools at our disposal in MAXQDA that allow us to think about our themes and assess whether the candidate themes really are. Okay, compiling clusters of codes is another thing that they talk about, and that can happen in a variety of different ways. Often people think about those top level codes and the subcodes that hang underneath them as clusters. So you could think of the top level code here, us and them, as the theme, okay, the candidate theme, and then these codes as being the codes that feed into that theme. And you can visualize that in a list view. That's one way of doing it, and that can also be generated. You can do recoding and reorganizing of your coding scheme in the smart coding tool, which actually functions in a very similar way to the categorized paraphrase tool, but this time you're working with coded segments rather than working with paraphrase segments. So it's just if you think about the process that we're going through as a kind of data reduction process, starting off with all our data, then starting to think about these are the interesting bits and then coding those bits, and we're slowly reducing down into our themes. We can also visualize that and work with that in maps and use the creative coding tool. There was a spotlight on creative coding earlier, I believe, which would be a really good one to have a look at as well. But here we can see that the thicker lines are showing us, beginning to show us relationships between codes, which is going to help also with thinking about what the potential themes might be useful. All right, let's move on to phase 4 very quickly, which is to develop the themes and review them. And I think I said earlier that you're continually reviewing everything in MAXQDA. Whenever you look at one thing, you're always able to quickly, by the click of a button, get back and see the context or see what it's related to or see how many times it occurs. And so that's really, really important in this process of developing and reviewing themes, because what they're talking about here is reviewing all of that work we've just done and starting to really think, are they really themes? Are they really capturing what the essence of what's going on in our data? So we need to go back to the full data set. We can see that here in the green as the whole level, and then back to the coded extracts again. And they talk here about radically revising the initial coding scheme and the ideas of what themes are. And that's something which some of those tools I mentioned earlier are also related to. So here we're now really getting into the realms of where the same tools, the same MAXQDA tools, can be used for a multitude of different phases. So I mentioned the creative coding a moment ago, and I want to also show you quickly crosstabs and models as being really useful here. Creative coding for radically revising your coding scheme, and crosstabs and models for thinking about relationships between themes. So this is the creative coding space. So you can put codes in and you can start to connect them in your in this kind of visual space rather than in a hierarchical list. And if you're happy with the changes that you're making that indicate that things ought to be subcodes of each other and so on, then you can implement that and have those changes be affected in your coding scheme. If that's interesting to you, go and check out that other spotlight. I've also find maps as really useful for developing and reviewing my themes. So here's an example of one code that's called Planning Ahead. And in there, I've got actual segments of data that have been coded there, and I can move those around and start thinking about, okay, well, are there differences going on at the level of the segments in relation to this code Planning Ahead? And I can start to visualize and think about that here. And I can also generate models in Max Maps to illustrate patterns and relationships, strengths of associations between themes or codes within the segments themselves. Another thing I can do on a more quantitative level is I can use crosstabs. So one thing I haven't mentioned yet is that we can apply variables. So if I'm working with interview participants, I might use variables to capture their socio-demographic characteristics. Here, what I've done is I've got variables for whether they're parents or not. So this is Facebook data, so we didn't know who they actually were. So I don't know actually whether they've got children or not, but sometimes what they say in a post tells me whether they've got children. So somebody might say, I haven't got kids and I am really happy about that, or not. So I know that they haven't got kids, and sometimes they say something about their own kids, and sometimes I can't tell from what they've said whether they've got children or not. And so here I'm starting to pick out, is there a difference in the way that these codes and the potential themes here, you can see I've got different types of themes from what we looked at before, are occurring in the data in relation to whether people have children or not. And again, I can visualize that qualitatively by generating a segment matrix from that. Jessica, you need to tell me if I need to stop, but because I think I've gone over my time. I'll carry on until I get told to stop. Refining, defining, and naming themes is the next phase. And I think that actually when you use MAXQDA, you're doing that all of the time. So it's not something that you do as a separate activity. But they talk here about writing a brief synopsis of each theme and then really deciding what the name of that theme is going to be. Okay, we can write brief synopses of themes in all kinds of different places. We could do that in a memo, but I've got here an illustration of doing that in a summary. I quite like doing that in summaries because then I can see it comparatively. So this is showing you summary grids. And we can also have AI assist help us with that if we want to. And then finally, just so that we've got a little bit of time to wrap up with any questions, the writing up phase. Something that I find super useful in any kind of project, not just a thematic analysis, when I use MAXQDA, is I can be writing all the time. So writing is part of the analysis process. In fact, some authors say writing is analysis. Very often you think you've got an idea about a theme, but then when you start to write it out, you start to crystallize those thoughts through the act of writing. So the writing tools and how well they are integrated into MAXQDA is a real delight, I think, for that kind of thing. But there's lots and lots of writing spaces. So I've mentioned these all before, but you've got paraphrases, comments, memos, the project log for capturing the process and summaries. You can have all kinds of different visualizations of the qualitative data, some but not all I've shown you today, and that's really helpful in your write-up. No longer does your write-up of a thematic analysis have to be only textual. I'm sure you've all read articles when it's just a paragraph, 2 quotes, and then another paragraph, and then a few more quotes. You can make it much more dynamic, much more alive by using visualizations. And then if you haven't looked at the QTT tool yet, then I'd highly recommend that you do that, because that's like a repository in MAXQDA where you can start to pull in the evidence for each theme. You might have a worksheet in the QTT tool for each theme, and then you're pulling in the evidence from your data and all of the different levels you've been working at there. You might also have a worksheet for each research question and so on, and you're pulling it all in. Okay, the last thing I'm going to say is that using MAXQDA for thematic analysis is really, really powerful because it maximizes your flexibility with working with your data. It really supports the iterative process that is part of thematic analysis and how people write about it. And you can be very transparent, okay? because everything is connected. And what's really important is that because everything is connected, those puzzle pieces don't have to happen. They don't have to occur. Those phases don't have to occur in sequence. You can move them all around. You can choose to play with your data and enact all of those different tasks that occur within those phases in all kinds of different ways as suits your working style as well as your method. Okay, sorry for going over a little bit, but here are a few key resources for you to pick out on this a little bit more. And if you like the ideas that I've shared with you today, I do whole long workshops on this. So do get in touch and I can let you know when the next one is. Okay, let me have a look. I'm going to start at the top of the chat and go back to that first one. Initially, I thought that my research would be grounded theory. After studying, I came across phenomenological analysis. How does the latter fit with a reflective thematic analysis? That's a really big question. So phenomenological analysis is all about the sort of lived experiences of the participants. Grounded theory is about building a theory from the data. So you're trying to build new theory with a grounded theory analysis, which is not necessarily the case with phenomenological and reflective thematic analysis. Reflective thematic analysis is really about ensuring that your positionality as a researcher is part of the analysis. So we're not trying we're not adhering to those sort of positivist criteria of eliminating bias and all that kind of thing when we do reflexive thematic analysis, because we see ourselves as the instrument of the analysis in a reflexive thematic analysis. To answer that question fully, I need like a whole hour, but hopefully that's given you a little bit. But do get in touch and I can share some resources on those topics if you like. I used Creswell model for thematic analysis. I found it related to my phenomenological study. Is Brown and Clark better? I wouldn't say that any method is better or not than another. They're different, and they are, so Brown and Clark are very popular at the moment because they've done a lot of really high quality writings, and lots of people have found those to be really useful. But that doesn't mean that it's the best form of thematic analysis. I think different forms of thematic analysis and different forms of analysis generally are appropriate in different contexts. So it's not a better or worse. Don't think about it like that. Think about it as what's appropriate for my study. You should choose a method based on the needs of your research questions. Okay, so if you feel that a particular method makes sense in terms of what you want to do, then that's great. But equally, you can mix and match methods, right? You don't have to follow one particular method to the letter. What I did in my PhD is I took elements of grounded theory and elements of thematic analysis and elements of discourse analysis and combined them in my PhD because that's what made sense with the data I had and what I wanted to look at. So methods are meant to be enabling. They're not meant to constrain you. If you feel like a method is stopping you from doing something that you want to do, then that's not a good thing. Okay, so methods are meant to enable us to get what we need out of our data and to understand our data. So don't feel, constrained by that. The next question, how did I make this graph? I don't know which slide I was showing when you put that question in. Maybe whoever wrote that question can describe what I was showing at that point, and I'll come back to it. So the next question, how is reflexive thematic analysis technique novel or different from others or even previously well-known thematic analysis? I didn't really talk about that in detail at the beginning of the session just because of lack of time. But actually, Brown and Clark themselves do quite a good job of explaining that. The way that I see it is that the way that they describe it, they categorize different types of thematic analysis according to what are the two different types that they've got. So they've got their own reflexive, and then they've got coding reliability and then code book analysis. And coding reliability is more on the positivist end of the methodological paradigm. Okay, whereas code book thematic analysis is more focused on the coding. But there are all kinds of different ways that you can conceptualize the difference. So sometimes you can conceptualize the difference in types of thematic analysis according to whether it's a deductive or an inductive process. Yes. So sometimes you start off with a code book and then you go looking for those things in the data. And other times you generate codes from the data, which is much more what they talk about in their process. But they also very clearly say that it's a flexible method. Yes, it's adaptable to different situations. So hopefully that's helpful. How do you report the naming of codes and themes? Do you always start a new project, or do you use a document beside to note the changes? Do you mean how I think that question means, there's two ways I could interpret that question. One way is, how do I capture the changes in the names as I go through the process of refining them? I would absolutely create backups of my MAXQDA project. I would do that every so often, just in case something goes wrong. So as a time-based thing, maybe at the end of every day, if you're working extensively, or every week, but also at significant moments of analytic movement. So if I was following Brown and Clark using those phases at the end of phase one, I'd save a project saying this is the end of phase one, so I can always go back and see what it looks like. But I would probably do that at different stages within the phases as well. The other way of thinking about that question is how you write about your names and your themes. And I think the definitions and the labels that you use are really key in terms of how you write up your thematic analysis. So, that's a key thing to think about as well. I see lots of MAXQDA projects with fairly descriptive code names, and you're not only your codes, but if you're doing a thematic analysis, you want the labels to be quite analytical, quite interpretive, because that captures that's better at capturing the breadth of the data, if that makes sense. But communicating how your themes occur in the data is a lot to do with the labeling and the definitions. What's the difference between thematic and qualitative analysis? Qualitative analysis is simply a broader term. So thematic analysis is a type of qualitative analysis. Discourse analysis is a type of qualitative analysis. So qualitative analysis is just a very broad term. If you say to me, I'm doing qualitative analysis, that doesn't tell me very much about the specifics of what you're doing, apart from the emphasis of your work. So thematic analysis is a more specific term. It's a type of qualitative analysis. Do you report reliability in thematic analysis? Depends on the type of thematic analysis. So sometimes yes, but not always. Depends on your positionality and whether you think reliability is something that's meaningful in the context of your project. And people differ in their conceptualizations of that.